This is Misha, and today's video is on the history and validity of gun control laws in the USA. Gun control laws are bad and stupid. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time. Oh, you wanted more? Sorry, I thought that was sufficient. I thought that was really all you really needed to know. Really, throughout, obviously the Second Amendment really established gun rights in America. That was 1791. And through the 19th century, there wasn't much out of Washington on restricting firearms. There were some laws in the South, Jim Crow type laws trying to restrict firearms ownership based on race and ethnicity and all that, but those were not federal laws. Really, the first federal law that tried to rein in and control who could receive and send guns was the Miller Act of 1927, and that addressed what kind of firearms could be just sent through the mail. And that was right when the crime wave was starting with the Roaring Twenties, the gangsters and whatnot. But the real response was the National Firearms Act of 1934 and cats. That's how the cat feels about that too. But yeah, the National Firearms Act was really the first attempt to regulate guns. As most of you know, that was what regulated machine guns. It set up a registry and a tax on automatic or select fire weapons. But some don't realize the whole reason we have SBRs today is originally the NFA was going to regulate all handguns, just like a machine gun. But they took that provision out. But what they left in is what became SBRs, because there was a provision in it originally in the bill that said you couldn't cut down a rifle or shotgun into pistol form. That would be illegal. The idea there was they didn't want people circumventing not being able to own and have registered handguns by just turning a regular unrelegated rifle into a handgun. But anyway, when they took the pistol part out, they didn't take out the part about SBRs and SBSs, so that's why we have those today. Also, the NFA regulated silencers, suppressors. Well, after that, and it's worth noting that was passed with a Democrat president and a Democrat Congress and Senate. In 1938, we had the Federal Firearms Act, and this is the first that started to set up the FFL system, the Federal Firearms Dealer Licensee system, and started to put restrictions on criminals and so on and so forth, transfers, and there it goes. Of course, then World War II happened, the Great Depression, and the Roaring Twenties were over, so things kind of quietened down throughout the 50s. But in 1968, you had the Gun Control Act, and that was in response to the Kennedy assassination and the Martin Luther King assassination. In 1968 is really important for a lot of reasons. Mostly, it was set about to control what was called Saturday night specials. In order to do this, it set up a points system for the importation of guns. That's why you'll see adjustable sights and target grips on pistols imported after 1968. Another thing that it did is it set up a thing where every gun had to be serialized. Every gun had to have manufacturer's information, which that was translated into an importer's marking. So if InterArms imported a gun, it was legally the manufacturer, so it had to have its information on the side. Before that, the only type of import mark that was really needed was the country. Early on, you'll see that things marked, say, Spain, and then later they would change it where it would say made in Spain. But after 1968, you would have to have InterArms, blah, 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 their address, and the serial of the gun. But at that time, they were often marking them on the barrel. So to have some visual aids here, here's an InterArms gun. This is my trusty Valmet M62. This is imported in the late 60s, maybe early 70s. This is the first Kalashnikov pattern gun to be imported into the USA. And I decided to show it as a visual aid. This is very, very similar to the military gun. About the only thing that they were starting to get picky on in the late 60s were grenade launchers, but even then they were pretty loose about it. All the parts are foreign. These can accept standard high-capacity AK magazines, and we're still pretty good at this point. The biggest deal is the importer's information that they're required to be row marked. Well, that was the status of things through the 80s. And we have another pre-ban here. This is a Hungarian SA-85M. It has the underfolding stock. These were imported by Kastner back from about 1985 through 1987-88, and they came in pretty well unmolested. They did have to comply with the 1968 gun control by having importers' markings and all that, but at this point they're still letting rifles come in, and pretty much just like the semi-autos. Now by this point they were getting a little stricter about making sure the guns weren't easily convertible to full auto. The ATF was getting pickier. You really can see this with the open to closed bolt conversions. In 1982, the ATF decided that an open bolt semi-auto was just too easy to convert to a closed bolt, so they said no more open bolt semi-autos. So guns like the Uzi and the Tech 9 and the Sterling and a few other subguns had to all be converted to working closed bolt. And if you look at the Uzi Model A, which started to be imported in 1981, you can already tell they had to make a lot of changes to make the ATF happy that it wasn't readily convertible to full auto. For example, it doesn't take full auto bolts at all. It has a restrictor bar in it. It can't take a full auto trigger pack. It's different on the bottom of the receiver. And there's a restrictor ring, so it can't take a short barrel. The 1934 our registry of SBRs is still, of course, in effect today, and it was back then. But in 1986, we have the Gun Owners Protection Act, which had the Hughes Amendment, which most every person interested in gun legislation is familiar with. That's what closed the machine gun registry. Up until that point, you could pretty much take any gun, pay $200, and convert it to full auto. It's exactly like SBRs are today. You can pretty much take any gun like this, convert it to a short barrel rifle after paying your tax. But in 1986, the Hughes Amendment passed as part of the Protection Act, and that wasn't all the act was. It was also a revamp of the 1968 Act. There was a lot of corruption in the ATF, and it had some positive aspects for gun owners. It was there to make the law more fair and to kind of curb abuse of power. So there was positive aspects. Also, you could, after then, have ammo shipped directly to your home. Before that, it had to go to a dealer. So there were some positive things, but it did close the machine gun registry. It's worth noting that at that time, we had a Republican president, we had a Republican Senate, and we had a Democrat Congress. So Washington was pretty well divided between the two parties, and there was support pretty much across the board, even though the Hughes Amendment was kind of stuck in at the last minute. But that's why today you cannot get a machine gun as a civilian made after May of 1986. So after the Firearms Owners Protection Act of 1986 with the Hughes Amendment, there was a large push in Washington at the time to be tougher on crime. Any of you who were alive during then know what I mean. It was a huge thing in the 1988 presidential election. So both Democrats and Republicans were vying to be tough on criminals. Unfortunately, both kind of saw assault weapons, assault rifles, as tools of criminals of the time. I'm trying to be very objective about this because if you look back at the political campaigning, that's what it was. In 1988, George Bush was elected president. In 1989, he signed an executive order which added about 56 different weapons and variations and clones and types of those weapons to the non-sporting list. For an executive orders are not to make law. They're to clarify existing law. So the existing law he clarified was the 1968 Gun Control Act. He said that, it set up this sporting purpose system, and guns like all these AKs, the Steyr AUG, were not sporting. So that's why you see a ban. Now, to classify these, they define them by a list of features, such as folding stock, bayonet lug, flash suppressors, so on and so forth, pistol grips. That's why after 1989, weapons like the SA-85 you just saw there turned into this. This is still an SA-85 made in Hungary. However, as you can see, it has this beautiful sporting stock on it. It has a non-threaded barrel. Some of these did come in with a muzzle nut tack welded on and threads underneath, but this one here has no threads at all. The bayonet lug is removed, and these shipped with 5 or 10 round low capacity magazines. These are how guns started to come in around 1990, and these are the first that when you hear of an import ban, 1989 was the import ban, and it was an executive order signed by George Bush. At that time, you did have a Democrat Congress and a Democrat Senate, but it was signed by a Republican president. And just to be clear, a lot of people protested this. They thought George Bush threw them under the bus, but a lot of other people, even in the conservative camp, were okay with it, because that was at the time when it was seen that these kinds of guns weren't useful for hunting, and it was kind of the era of the no honest person. And at the same time, crime control was a huge issue, and so these were kind of lumped in with that. In 1993, the Brady Bill was passed into law. Essentially what the Brady Bill did, which was named after James Brady, Reagan's press secretary, it set up a waiting period and then eventually a background check system for all firearms purchases. Now this was signed into law by President Bill Clinton, who was elected in 1992, and we did have a Democrat Congress and Senate at the time. And this really led to the 1994 assault weapons ban. Oh boy. This is probably the biggest thing to talk about of our era. The assault weapons ban was actually part of a much larger crime bill. I think it's like public safety something, and it was like the full-fledged name of the act that became the assault weapons ban was like the Safe Gun Act and so on. And you can look all that up on Wikipedia. I don't have it memorized, but it was actually part of a very large crime bill. So don't think that was passed exclusively. This same bill also authorized the hiring of 100,000 new police officers. It made it tougher on criminals. It introduced the 3-strike rule. It introduced tracing of sex offenders. It had more funding to help prevent violence against women, so on and so forth. So this assault weapons ban was a tiny part of a huge conglomerate bill. Now, to be clear, this was passed by the Congress and the Senate and signed into law by Bill Clinton. But it was not an executive order. It was a bill which turned into a law through Congress. So it was, completely legal. It was challenged in court and it never stood up. And what it was basically an extension of the 1989 import ban, but it applied the whole feature series to domestic guns. So now AR-15s could not have bayonet lugs, and they could not have collapsing stocks, and so on and so forth. What's interesting, a gun like this, imported, in the early 90s, might have come with a short 5 or 10 round mag, but it has a standard mag well, so you can put a standard mag in it. So there wasn't much there. You could also, legally, once these were imported, convert them over, like this weapon I have here. That was a Hungarian. This is a MAD. This was imported immediately after the assault weapons ban in 1995. And it's really, since this was already having to comply with all the 1989 sporting requirements for imports, the assault weapons ban domestically didn't change anything for it. These still could accept standard magazines like I have here. And when they came in, though, they did have this here thumbhole stock. Isn't it purty? But once these came in, you could take these off, put them on, so on and so forth. Now, since the assault weapons ban did sunset, after that, you could actually remove the muzzle nut that was on here and screw on a muzzle brake. But a lot of these didn't have anything, or they just came in with the muzzle nuts tack welded on. The bayonet lug is still ground off and so on. That was the 90s. These guns were still able to be imported with high cap double stack magwells. But in 1998, the ATF reinterpreted all the previous existing laws and said, you know what? Guns that come in not only should come with these little dinky mags, they should only be able to accept low capacity mags. So after 98, you start to see guns coming in that take single stack magazines. And this killed a lot of imports at that point. Others had to adapt, like the Wasser. But it's interesting to note that by 1998, while we still have a Democrat in the White House, Bill Clinton, we have a Republican Congress and a Republican Senate. But that's the order of things. They also added 50 more types of weapons, including the Steyr USR, to the 68 Gun Control Act, still declaring them as non-sporting. So, Bush started it, Clinton continued it, the ATF added to it in 98. Also, to backtrack just for a second, in 1994, Clinton did ban the further import of Chinese rifles because China basically got up to some nonsense and was breaking import agreements. But Chinese guns were banned separately from the assault weapons ban in 1994 as well. This anti-gun push for evil-looking guns was nearly bipartisan back in the late 80s and early 90s because people wanted to be tough on crime, and this often got lumped in with that because it was seen that these guns were used mostly by criminals. Now, you and I today know this is complete bullshit, but, politics and things get twisted around. So it was definitely a fad of that era, which really culminated with the single stack imports of 1998. And at that time, any domestic gun made had to ship with a 10-round mag, or if it had a higher capacity magazine, like at that time the SAR-1 shipped with, it had to be made before 1994 because the assault weapons ban had a caveat for high capacity magazines. It also couldn't have, like I said, bayonet lug, a threaded barrel, at least exposed threads, flash hider, and so on and so forth. It also had regulations on pistols that they couldn't weigh more than a certain amount or be over a certain size. So things are pretty restrictive in the late 90s, and it sucked. I lived through this, that you couldn't get a lot of interesting guns. The only saving grace of that era, a lot of really interesting military surplus guns were coming in from the former Comblock nations from East Europe at that time. So a lot of us just started buying Mosin Nagants and K98s and Enfields because they were cheap and available at that era. But if you wanted to, you could buy a thumbhole type gun and convert it. Later, companies like Century would start selling moddies that came pre-converted with a number of U.S. parts installed, and that's how one way they got around the import restrictions. But up until 2004, they still could not have evil features. But in September of 2004, the assault weapons ban sunset. There were some attempts to revive it, but they didn't go anywhere. So it was allowed to finally sunset in September 13th of 2004. And statistics have shown that it didn't prevent crime. it just didn't. Not many of these types of guns are used in the committal of crime, and restricting cosmetic features was nothing more than a feel-good. So, after 2004, companies were again allowed to ship guns with full features inside the USA. Manufacturers like Colt and Bushmaster could go back to shipping guns the way they did in the 80s. However, keep in mind the 68 and thus the 89 bans for imports were still in effect today. We're no better off today than we were in 1989 and 1998, because the import bans are still in effect. This is why guns come in with thumbhole stocks and are missing bayonet lugs and all that. If you see an imported gun with the folding stock, that was done here in the USA by manufacturers such as Arsenal of Bulgaria and Las Vegas. What they do, these guns, like this one here, this is an SLR 104 FR. These are made in Bulgaria. They have a thumbhole stock, they have a muzzle nut welded over the barrel threads, and they do not have the bayonet lugs cut out. These are brought in by Arsenal of Las Vegas, and once they're safely here through customs, they replace the thumbhole stock with this folding stock and pistol grip. They take a lathe or a mill and they machine out the bayonet lug here and the accessory lug here, and they unweld the muzzle nut and screw on in this case, muzzle brake, but they could put on a flash hider. They also add enough U.S. parts, in this one's case 6, U.S. handguard, U.S. pistol grip, U.S. buttstock, and U.S. trigger grip. That makes 6. This can accept high-capacity magazines. Now, the way they get around the 1998 prohibition on bringing in high-capacity guns is when these come in, they do not have a bullet guide. So in order to feed from mags, the mags have to be special 10-round mags with a bullet guide built in. Once they get in the USA, they add a bullet guide, and then they can feed from standard, in this case, 30-round 5.45 by 39 mags. And this is a very current gun. Guns like this started to appear around 2005 after the sunset. But something else happened in 2005 that really, really stunk. Up until this point, a lot of people were buying parts kits and building them on U.S. receivers. Well, in 2005, the government decided that it no longer wanted to allow barrels to be brought in with parts kits. Now, it's not that simple, but I'm boiling it down. After that, barrels had to be cut up. It's worth noting that even though this was a bureaucratic decision taken by the ATF, it was done with a Republican in the White House and a Republican Senate and a Republican Congress. But so the barrel ban really kind of dampened the assembly of guns using parts kits, which made people again kind of turn to imports. Since that time, we've seen an explosion of neat and interesting guns coming into this country from overseas, and they work around the 1999 ban. Sometimes they even assemble them here in the USA like IWI USA does. So there was a few various workarounds. So that's pretty much the status of gun control. President Obama has been in, obviously, for just under 8 years now. Under his administration, not much has changed. It's worth noting that in 2010, that they started to allow firearms to be carried in national parks again. In 2013, after Sandy Hook, he did sign a long laundry list of executive orders pertaining to firearms, but most of them were just housekeeping measures, like appointing a new director of the ATF. They didn't really do anything. The biggest thing that happened under his watch, it's basically a business thing against companies in Russia. He had a list of Russian companies that were either owned by the Russian government or were predominantly controlled by individuals in the Russian government. So Kalashnikov concern, of which Izhmash was part of that list, where these companies could not be dealt with by American companies. That's why guns like the Sega and the SGL disappeared after 2014, yet guns like the Vepr from Molot are still allowed in because they were not part of Kalashnikov concern and they weren't deemed to be predominantly under the influence of the Russian government. Of course, this had really very little to do with gun control and more to do with the disagreement over the Ukraine and Crimea and all that, political back and forth. Most of the companies on that list were not arms producers. It just so happens that one or two were. So that is that, and unfortunately that restriction is still in place. Many are hoping today, late 2016, that it will be lifted soon, but that's just speculation. That's pretty much where we're at. I kind of wanted just to do a brief overview. I know I've kind of simplified a few things, but that's gun control in the U.S. over the last 80 years in a nutshell. There's a lot more to research. I encourage anyone who's interested in this, do your own research. Don't just read online one source or listen to one source and take that as gospel, because it's very important to be informed about what is going on and what's really happening, not just what the news tells you is or isn't happening. Do your own research, whether you be on the left, the right, the center, up, down, bottom, who cares, sideways. It's important to try to look into this stuff for yourself. And, we're all here, we like guns, and I don't think any of us like people being killed with guns when they didn't deserve it, but what we've been doing is not effective, and it's only harming those of us who want to obey the laws. So I just kind of wanted to do as much of a objective look at gun control laws in the U.S. as possible without letting emotion get too involved in it. And I spent, a few weeks researching this. I lived through a lot of it, so it helps, but just kind of wanted to bring it up. It's a little different video for this channel. Please feel free to comment, but let's not get too aggressive in the section below. I know it does stir up a lot of feelings, myself included, but, let's try to keep it constructive because we're all in this together, and, it's just something to keep out for. Me, myself, and I'd love to see the 89 repealed, followed by the SBR registry. I'd love to see SBRs just be like regular guns. And I'd love to be able to get foreign imported guns without all this silly, back and forth, around and around stuff. Well, as always, we really appreciate you tuning in. This is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.